So thank you all for being here on Juneteenth. Juneteenth. Everybody clap it up for our federal holiday. Clap it up for Freedom Day. It has been really a long time coming. A lot of people think that the fact that we have Juneteenth as a federal holiday, that it just popped up. But it was years and years and decades and even centuries of working and pushing towards that type of legislation, pushing towards the country recognizing that holiday and recognizing that the fact that we even have to celebrate that holiday means that there was a grave mistake done on the part of the country of not letting Black people know that they were free, and using that time to get that last harvest, that last, year of crops to come in before to get the last little bit of money they could get out of us as free labor before they would be free. And so anyway, I decided to take this time to talk a little bit about Juneteenth, talk a little bit about, much of you probably already know, because it is a federal holiday, it's kind of mainstream, it's more popularized now. We're still going to talk a little bit about it, just in case there's some things you may not have known about the holiday. And then we're going to talk about self-determination. So we're going to talk about some self-sufficient Black towns throughout our history. In our last class, we discussed and we talked about what? Does anybody remember what we talked about last time? Harlem Renaissance, W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Wall Street. We talked about that last time. And we were talking about the 1920s, Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, talking about ways in which Black people were fighting for self-respect and self-determination, believing, can you put some books right there? Believing that we could do this for ourselves, believing that we could no longer try to work within the American system, but believing that we should have our own nation, should have our own system, should have our own, and we're smart enough and we're organized enough because we are the world's oldest people. We're smart enough to be able to do this on our own and for ourselves. So we were on that type of path. And I figured we continued in that same type of conceptual idea, but talk about how Marcus Garvey wasn't the first person to think about this. And that there were Harlem wasn't the first city, if you will, even though Harlem was also very much politically run and economically run in very large sense by white folks. But there were other Southern towns and Midwestern towns that were fully functional and operated just by Black people. And one of the ones that we know of that's more popular was Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is also called what? Tulsa, Oklahoma. What was the nickname given to Tulsa, Oklahoma? Black Wall Street. Y'all may be familiar with Black Wall Street, okay? So we're gonna talk a little bit about that, talk about some things you may not have known. And for those who, raise your hand if you've never heard of Black Wall Street or Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, everybody, okay, good. So we may be talking about some things some parts of it that you haven't heard of. So we'll discuss that in a second. And then if we have time, we're also gonna talk about another self-sufficient Black town right here in Florida, right? In fact, it is the oldest self-governing Black town in America, right? And it was official right here in Florida, not too far, maybe about 2 hours from Jacksonville. Does anybody know the name of that town? Eatonville. Eatonville. And Eatonville is known for very, very close to Orlando. You go through Eatonville right to get to Orlando. I think now it might be like Winter Park, Maitland, yeah. But that was called Eatonville. And what famous person came out of Eatonville? Zora Neale Hurston, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Eatonville because, I like to bring in local history because it's important for us to understand the significance of where we live. A lot of times you have young people that may live in a certain place, Jacksonville included, and they may not even know how much history and how much culture actually comes from where they live because they don't know. And they don't know because we haven't taught them. So that's our job. That's our responsibility to have spaces like this where young people can learn about their history and learn about where they come from, okay? So anyway, that's what we're going to do today. Of course, we always start with just kind of explaining for those who are new, explaining what this class is about and what we're doing here. And this is called the People's African History class, or the People's African Saturday School. Some people call it Saturday School because it's kind of similar to what Jews do. Jews have been doing this very thing for decades and decades, teaching their own children, creating Saturday schools very similar to this. They've been doing this for decades and decades to teach their children their history and their culture. Black people was doing it even before them. And so this is just a revitalization of what we've already been doing and what Jews have been popularized for doing. And so that's essentially what we're doing here. And the people means is for us, by us. This is a place where we learn from each other, where we discuss and where we share knowledge. I'm up here, I'm facilitating, but I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts. And if there's something that you know that I don't know, I want you to, raise your hand and say it. Or if you have a comment, you can say it. I try to use this this microphone because, and once I get a stand, maybe I'll have a stand or something. When I get some more money, I can mic the whole place and it could be better. But I like for y'all to use the microphone because there are people that watch online and they want to hear what you all have to say as well. So they can hear me, but they can't sometimes hear you in the audience. So if you have something to say, I can give you the microphone and you can ask a question or anything like that. But this is a collective learning process. It's not like school where it's just me talking to you and you got to take notes and prepare for a test. This is all of us working together to learn about these topics. And this is to uplift all of us, all Black people, not just some, not just most, but all of us, men, women, upper class, middle class, no matter where you're from or what your background or ethnicity, this is for all African people. When I say African people, some people call themselves African, some people don't. Some people say I'm Black American, African American. If you melanated in here, you African. So we talk about all of y'all, all of us. And we talk about our history from Africa all the way to the United States and abroad. So we're not just talking about what happens on the continent. Some people think that when they hear about the People's African History class, but we're talking about African people all over the world. So, and if you want to donate, please feel free to scan the QR code if you want to donate and, just support what we have going on here. And again, make sure you sign the sign-in sheet either as you come in or as you leave, just so that you know what's going on and what's happening here and just be reminded of the classes and everything like that. So that's what we have. And yeah, happy Juneteenth. So let's get right into it. The takeaway here, and I like to do a takeaway because sometimes people have to leave. And so if you have to leave, the one thing I want you to take away is just the significance of this day, of Juneteenth, of this weekend. And Juneteenth is a significant day in American history and the African American experience. And the name is a play on the date of June 19th. And on that day was when a representative from the Union Army made his way to Galveston, Texas, under the leadership of General Gordon Granger. And this was the day that he announced to the people of Texas that all enslaved Africans were free. So that is why we celebrate it, because when the Civil War ended, and technically we were free once the 13th Amendment was passed, but when the 13th Amendment was passed, when the Civil War ended, Black people were free from chattel slavery in the traditional sense, if you will. However, there were people not just in Texas. It was Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, several states. There were white so-called owners or white landowners that still wanted enslaved people to work for them because we're saying, well, we don't, they didn't have internet, they didn't have social media where you could shoot a tweet and now everybody in the world know a thing. This was in the 19th century. So something could happen in Ohio and people in Texas may not know or Florida may not know for months and months and months. And so these white slave owners or white landowners use this to their advantage and said, okay, well, we know that the Civil War has ended slavery, but we're not going to tell the people that work for us because we want them to keep working, right? So they didn't. And again, it wasn't just in Texas, this was in other places as well. And so the Union Army sent people across the country to let folks know, hey, the South is back a part of the Union now. The war is over, and now you have to, by law, let these people go, right? And so these people in Texas were still working, even though they were free, and it was announced that freedom had come to a degree, freedom had come to the United States. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to start with this quote. When peace comes, they read the Emancipation Law to the colored people. The so-called freed slaves spent that night singing and shouting, they wasn't slaves no more. And this was said by a former enslaved person, African Pierce Harper, in 1937. If you don't know, in the 1930s, the government gave out grants to have scholars, historians, researchers go around and interview enslaved Africans from all over the country. So if you go to the Library of Congress, I'm sure you could probably find it online as well. There are thousands of audio interviews of formerly enslaved people that were taken up in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And Zora Neale Hurston was one of those people that went around interviewing them. So that's how we have these quotes, right, from people that were enslaved during that time. So just to talk a little bit about that, to go back through this story, General Robert Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, right, during the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, and that caused the end of the war, but this did not immediately come to Texas. So many of them either didn't know or didn't tell people, and particularly enslaved people, that they were free. And so many enslavers, especially those from Louisiana and Mississippi, still hid the fact that enslaved people were free. And so Texas enslavers refused to emancipate them, and they refused to acknowledge that the war actually was over. And so a lot of enslaved people didn't know about it. And for those who did know, how do you think they found out? Word of mouth. What else? Black soldiers that worked through the Union, right? And Marvin Gaye also told us how we found out. How did we find out? Marvin Gaye told us. We heard it through the what? Through the grapevine. That's what we call it, right? Heard it through the grapevine. And essentially what the grapevine was it was a place, right, that Black people would go to whenever they would work. They would meet at the grapevine, and that's where they would talk and discuss the gossip, right, what was happening in our community. And so that's why we say I heard it through the grapevine, right, because that was where we would meet in the grapevine and backyards and things of that nature in order to find out what was happening in our community. So the grapevine was, again, like social media now, right? So when we found out, when the Union soldiers came down and told Black folks that they were free, A lot of us, of course, like what we do, it was Jubilee. We were singing, we were dancing in the streets, we were happy, and we threw a party, essentially. We threw a party like what we do. And so, and this started the tradition of Juneteenth, right? On June 19th, or really on June 20th, was when they got together, had food, sang, danced, prayed, and celebrated the fact that we were finally free from enslavement. And so this continued to happen every year just in Texas, right? This tradition didn't spread until much later, until around the 1960s and 70s was when that tradition started to spread outside of Texas. But we'll talk about that in a second. But this continued on ever since that time period. Even in the early 1890s, that's where the popular phrase Juneteenth started. And they would call it Jubilee Day. So even during that time, it was a tradition, but it didn't have a name. And the name didn't come about until the latter part of the 19th century. So this is about 30, maybe 30 years after the this actually happened, where Black people were free, right? So, and so this is just a picture right here of a Juneteenth parade, a Juneteenth celebration in Houston. This was at the Houston Public Library. I'm assuming this was in Houston, Texas. And this is just a woman, two women on a chariot being pulled by a horse in front of Antioch Baptist Church in Houston, Texas, during the celebration of Juneteenth. And this is back in the 1890s. So again, this is going to show that this was something that was continually celebrated. But again, very local, not just local to Galveston, but just local to Texas. Many people in Texas knew about this, this celebration. And then in the early 1900s, the celebration started to go outside of Texas, right? And it still stayed mostly within the Southwest region. So Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana started to have these Independence Days, started to have these Freedom Days every June 19th, right? That's when it was popular. And yeah, people just started celebrating because they started hearing about it word of mouth. Right, when people would visit Texas and go home and say, hey, you know, they're celebrating on June 19th. Have you heard this story about Freedom Day? And Black people didn't know they were free yet, and blah, 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 blah. And so they're starting to tell it across the Southwest. And then it wasn't until the 1970s was when it became much more nationwide, as Black people started to, in the 60s and 70s during the Black Power movement, where Black people were starting to tap into their history and wanting to know more collectively about our history and wanting to know more about African history and tapping more into our African pride, was when this story really began to gain popularity. And so this is where it started to spread in the 1980s in California, Wisconsin, Georgia, DC. It started to spread all over the country by the 1980s as more and more people began to hear about this celebration, right, of Juneteenth. And so it became popular then. And then by the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, so coming into the 2000s, it became much more international, this celebration. So my question to you is, and we'll talk about why we're celebrating it on today and why now it is a federal holiday. And I'll actually talk about that after we talk about this question. But my discussion question to you is, when did you first hear about Juneteenth? Anybody? Oh, I see you. Sorry. Hold on. Go ahead. Kindergarten? For real? That was how long ago? Maybe like in the 2010s or something? 2000. When you were in kindergarten? Oh, 2015. Okay. Okay, 2015, 16. Okay. So that was, okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Anybody else? When did you first hear about Juneteenth? In the 90s? Okay. All right. Anybody else? I think I first heard about it in maybe the 2000s, maybe like the end of the 2000s. I think it was when I moved to Atlanta. I had never heard about it, and there was a guy from Texas, and he left Texas, moved to Atlanta, and he used to have he by himself. I guess he had some connections in the city. Used to throw this big Juneteenth parade, and they would have HBCU bands and different groups, and it started out really small, and then it grew and grew into a big thing. But I had never heard of Juneteenth before that. And then once he started putting on those parades and they would have different things in the city, then I was like, oh, I never heard of this holiday. Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Mhm. Mm, mm. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. Word of mouth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they were learning. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I go, well, what?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was for them a normal thing
Mm.
that when they progressed up the coast and it wasn't celebrated, they didn't say anything.
Oh.
You know what I'm saying? They
Your
didn't
friends from
share.
Texas didn't say anything.
My friends from Texas didn't share what was going on in Texas
There. Okay.
on the 19th. So my familiarization with Juneteenth is really recent.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Gotcha.
Even though I've been studying Black history since forever, Juneteenth never zoomed in, my information bank. But now I'm aware.
Yes. Yes. That's interesting. A lot of just kind of figured out along the way. It shouldn't be that way. These are things we should have been taught in y'all's history books, in your history books, and just like we're taught about Fourth of July, just like we're taught about Yom Kippur, just like we're taught about Columbus Day, right? Just like we're taught about all of these other days. This is not just significant to Black people. This is significant to American history, and so it's crazy how this is just skipped over, right? And so it shouldn't be something we just kind of pick up along the way. This is something that should be in our history books, but sadly it's not. And the rate things are going, I don't know if it ever will be. And that's why we have spaces like this where we can bring our kids and we can bring adults and people to come and learn about these types of things. So now, another question I had, as we know, this became more popular it was either 2020 or 2021 when 2021, when Joe Biden signed a bill or signed a document, legislation, stating making Juneteenth a federal holiday, right? Now, what else was happening during this time in our nation around 2020, 2021? What was happening? It was COVID. Capitol was invaded. 2020. Does everybody remember the protests of 2020? What was the major? George Floyd happened, right? And when George Floyd happened, it was eruption everywhere, right? People are protesting. Cities are burning down. I mean, people are angry, people are upset, people getting arrested, and not just Black folks and not just people of color, there are white people who are also a part of this unrest, this political and social unrest, right? And so you have these things going on, and some people believe that, and there was a call for there to be a defunding of the police. There was a call for us to put more pressure on legislation and put more on the justice system, the so-called justice system, to give justice to people who were unlawfully murdered by the police, right? And so some people believe that it was during this time that now all of a sudden the president decides, oh, let me make Juneteenth a federal holiday, right? Which is a great thing, but some people think that it was used to kind of placate what Black people were really asking for during that time, right? Black people were asking for actual substantive, meaningful change to help ensure our lives and our safety, and instead we got a federal holiday, right? So there's these kinds of conversations that have been had throughout, right, history, throughout even more recent history, about why we even have this holiday. Grateful, it's wonderful to celebrate, but what does that mean if you still have the situation where the young brother gets killed in South Carolina, gets shot in his back, right? Because he was accused of stealing a water, right? You know? And a little baby in Mississippi that was 1 year old that was recently murdered by the police. 1 year old baby. What does that mean? And so, do you think making this Juneteenth a federal holiday has taken away from its cultural meaning, as well as some of the larger things that we've been asking for and fighting for in our communities?
So when you wrote that question up there, I was not sure of the answer.
Is it on?
I wasn't sure.
Okay.
I wasn't sure of exactly what cultural meaning was. I understood the second part of what you were asking when you tacked on, you know, the implications was it something to kind of distract us away from tangibles that we were asking for.
Right.
On that part, I could say yes, but could you fill me in a little bit more about the cultural meaning? Because if I mean, I'm kind of miffed about Juneteenth anyway in terms of what we want from it, because if we're celebrating the end of what I would call manacled slavery, as in like freedom from chains, but it was no sovereignty for us after this. We just transitioned from being released from manacled slavery into Jim Crow apartheid. Did we really get free or just free from chains? That's the first question. So I wasn't even sure that Juneteenth was a cultural celebration. Are we celebrating our culture? Are we simply celebrating release from manacled slavery? But I guess anything can kind of evolve, given that I've seen, you know, red, black, green, and gold meshed in as African symbols fine. So we're celebrating just Africanness around a holiday that was supposed to acknowledge our freedom. Is it Pan-Africanism? Generally using any kind of holiday. What does cultural meaning mean to you? And then maybe I would be a little less miffed about what this question means to me.
Right.
So when I say cultural
Meaning, when I'm saying cultural meaning, like we were talking about earlier, in Texas, they were celebrating Juneteenth. There was celebration. There was a telling of the stories. There was cookouts, right? There were things that mean something to Black people, certain foods that would be eaten on this day, stories that would be told. There was gatherings that would occur when this story was celebrated, right? Yesterday, I asked my daughter, I said, today is Juneteenth, right? She said, yes. I said, do you know what Juneteenth is? Do you know what it means? She said, no. Right? She had no idea. She just knew that we were off. She wasn't going to camp that day. She knew that people were off that day. That's it. Right? And oftentimes that's what happens when things become more popular. Sometimes the meaning gets taken away. Sometimes the celebration of it, or the reasons why we celebrate it, or some of the significant things related to the celebrations get taken away after it becomes more popular. And now I think, unfortunately, if we don't tell this story, and if we don't make sure that our children and the young people know the history of Juneteenth, then the cultural meaning behind the holiday would just be, oh, this is a day where we just don't go to school, or we just don't go to work. Very similar to Labor Day. Most people don't know what Labor Day means. Most people just know we're off, but they don't know the history of the labor movement in America, right? Again, that cultural meaning has kind of been taken away, and it's just been reduced to a day off. So do we think, hopefully that answers your question and helps you gain further understanding around what I mean when I say the cultural meaning being taken away. Maybe cultural and historical meaning, I should say, taken away. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 All right. Mm-hmm. 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 Gotcha. Yeah. So these are just some of the things that's important for us to explore and determine when we're talking about our history and our culture and the things that we celebrate, right? Whether it be, and particularly our African American holidays or holidays related to African American history and culture, whether it be Martin Luther King Day holiday, whether it be Kwanzaa, whether it be Juneteenth. It's wonderful that we have these days. It's wonderful that we have some of these days off. It's wonderful that these days have been recognized to some degree by the larger society. But it's even more important that we understand the meaning, the historical meaning, the cultural meaning, the significance behind these days and these celebrations. So next thing I want to talk about is In Search of History, the night Tulsa burned. This information comes from a documentary. If you want to write it down and look at the full documentary, it's very interesting. It's from a series called In Search of History, and the name of it is The Night Tulsa Burned. So you can Google it, you can find it online. It may be available on YouTube. And we're going to talk a little bit about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this concept of Black Wall Street. Most people know it as Black Wall Street. Most people know Tulsa, Oklahoma as this place where all of these Black people lived and had their own businesses and schools, and they did business with each other, and it was a very rich town. And all that is very true. But where did they come from? How did this happen? And Oklahoma's kind of random, a random place to just all kind of gravitate to. So why did they all move here? Them the initial loans to start these businesses. Where did all this come from? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So in the 1830s, Oklahoma was a promised land, and it was home of many minority groups, particularly those that were unwanted by the United States. And originally, Oklahoma was really a place for which group of people? Yes. Yeah. I think the last one died not too long ago. It was an older woman now, but she was like around 5 or 6 at the time. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, yeah. And initially, it wasn't even a Black city. It wasn't a Black state. Who was actually here before? The indigenous people. It was actually a Native American state, right? And as white people, as Americans started to move out west, as you had the Western expansion that was happening during the 1800s, right? There was a specific, it wasn't a movement, but there was that occurred in the 1820s and the 1830s. What was that called? The Trail of Tears. Y'all familiar with the Trail of Tears? Y'all probably heard about that in school. The Trail of Tears occurred, and it just occurred, but it was Andrew Jackson. And what was the Trail of Tears? What did Andrew Jackson do that led to what we know as the Trail of Tears? Exactly. So as white folks were taking over more and more of the southeastern part of the United States, which had the most fertile land, and Native Americans had already been on that land, they started to encroach more and more on their territory. They had to move them somewhere. So they began to move them towards places like Oklahoma. And they didn't move them by getting fancy things like that. No, they had to walk all the way from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and walk all the way to Oklahoma, where they were on small reservations. They were placed on these small reservations with little food, little water, little resources, and they were the southeast, right? So that's essentially what we have. When the Civil War came about, right, it brought freedom to the enslaved people. So we just talked about that, brought to the enslaved, and more and more people started to move out west. Now, one thing many people don't know is these Native Americans that were moved out west, some of them were slave owners, right? Some of them owned Black people. And so because some of them owned Black people, there were Black folks who were a part of the Trail of Tears. And they were also moved with the so-called Native American masters out to Oklahoma. So these are some of your early black settlers on the state, right? In the state. Government migrated these Native Americans out to Oklahoma. And then Oklahoma began to get split up into these twin territories. Oklahoma being white territory and then Indian territory. And so shortly thereafter, or not shortly, but a couple of decades later, President Ben Harrison opened up the Oklahoma territory. And this was done because more and more white settlers were asking and wanting to build up these areas. And so the Homestead Act was passed, which opened up land, particularly for white folks. And Dr. King talks about this as a kind of reparations for the Civil War, right? And Dr. King talks about how white folks were given these so-called reparations, giving those opportunity to the people in which you really stole the land from, which were the Native Americans and the black folks. And so President Ben Harrison was kind of urged by white people to open up this land. And so he, from the pressure from white settlers in 1889, he created this bill that part of Homestead Acts that allowed for this land to be purchased. And literally within 24 hours, thousands of white people looked for homesteads in the new frontier. So you had thousands of white folks flooding to Oklahoma, flooding to the Southwest to try to get their hand on this land. And black people were a part of that rush. So when black folks heard about it, they started rushing to buy up land as well. And it was cheap. It wasn't very expensive. Actually, there were Florida land, a lot of Florida land was a part of that homestead. That's actually where Eatonville came up, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But there were certain parts of Florida that the government basically allowed for white settlers to come and buy, and black folks saw land here in the northern part of Florida and decided to buy that land and eventually Eatonville, which was the first all-black settlement. So from 1890 to about 1900, you see the population, the black population of Oklahoma go from 3,000, right? And literally in a decade, go from 3,000 to 55,000 people. That's how many black people were coming to Oklahoma, taking advantage of this land, taking advantage of this opportunity to buy up this land, specifically black people with money, right? And so black people came in and they were cattlemen, they were cowboys, they were railroad workers, and they began to build up areas and towns and cities in the Oklahoma area. And that's essentially where, many cities started in Oklahoma.
Dr. Grant, it's interesting you should bring up Oklahoma. Does everybody remember the mascot of the University of Oklahoma? No one? The Sooners, right?
Oklahoma Sooners?
Right.
Okay.
So everybody knows whenever they have their football games, they have this wagon that has the white sheet over the wagon called the Sooner wagon, right? So it's interesting, Dr. Grant, you brought up about the white settlers rushing out to Oklahoma, and significant that the University of Oklahoma has that Sooner wagon because the whites were rushing out to Oklahoma to grab the land up, in many cases before the cavalry could clear the land and protect the land for the white settlers, the incoming white settlers from native peoples. So the wagons were called the Sooner wagons because the white people were coming too soon before the settlers could be protected by the cavalry.
Hold on, because I saw her hand and I'll come to you. Go ahead. What'd you say? Oh, he answered it. Okay, gotcha. Say that again.
They came here because they heard it was a bunch of gold in America. They came looking for the gold. There was one white man, I can't remember his name now. He came to St. Augustine looking for what they call the Fountain of Youth.
So
Yeah, I heard about that.
began to move to Florida.
But he didn't find it.
He didn't buy it. No. He thought he was going to find the fountain of youth
You
here.
thought it was water, but the fountain of youth is in your own body.
Oh, talk about it. Talk about it.
Yeah, and I know one thing. What happened to when the white people came to America? From what I read, they found these gigantic stone statues of people called the Olmecs, and they had the toe text. These gigantic black heads weighing 6 tons. What happened to those people who put them tons of statues over there in Texas and places like that?
Okay, there we go. Oh yeah, we talked about that before.
Yeah, Olmecs.
Yeah.
But one burning question. When Cortez came here and they wiped out the Incas and the Aztecs, and there was another bunch of Indians called them Mayans. They couldn't find the Mayans. Why they didn't find the Mayans? But they wiped out the Aztecs and they wiped them Indians out. So how did they do that? Where did the Indians come from that was in America? Where did they come from? So over there? How did they get to America? The Indians that was already over here. You got any research on that?
Hello, testing. I don't know why that one is going out. So we've talked about that. That kind of takes us back to what we were talking about months and months ago, where we talked about the Olmecs, we talked about the Aztecs, we talked about they came before Columbus. We talked about all of the sources that discuss the relationships between African people as well as Native American people. And so that kind of takes us into a different discussion. But I think to answer your question, many got wiped out when Christopher Columbus came, so-called came in 1492, and then even before then, right? When the Vikings also were here as well, more so stayed in the northern part, but also began to also help in the wiping out of the native people here in this country. And so when you talk about the wars and we talk, what's going on with these microphones? Testing. The wars that were going on, Europeans and the Native Americans, the diseases were what was wiping people out long before many of these wars that were happening between Europeans and then the Native Americans, long before that was happening. So, but in terms of, where was I? Trying to think where I was. Okay, well, we'll just start on this section. Talking about Black people moving into these territories. Some Black people started to turn Indian territory into these. Testing. Okay. All right, we'll keep this here. So Black folks started to turn Indian territory into Black settlements. And I would say maybe between the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, there became 27 all Black towns that were created in Oklahoma. 27. So Tulsa was not the only one. Tulsa was the biggest one, right? But it wasn't the only one. There were all Black towns all over the state of Oklahoma. And this was before Oklahoma was technically a state. It hadn't received statehood as of yet, right? It hadn't received statehood. And Black people remained in these all Black towns in Oklahoma and cities in Oklahoma, again, one of them being Tulsa. After statehood, eventually statehood was granted, and after statehood was approved, the first bill that they passed, once they made Oklahoma an official state in the nation, was segregation. As the first thing they made legal in Oklahoma was say, okay, now that it's a real state, this state is going to be segregated, right? And so they had a Black side and they had a white side, and we'll talk about that more in a second and what that had to do with the creation of Tulsa. Black Wall Street, so again, going back to the late 19th century, Black Wall Street, though these Black people were moving to the state of Oklahoma and particularly the city of Tulsa, one these were mostly probably maybe working class people, working upper middle class people, people with skills that were coming to build these towns. And again, 27 all black towns, but they were very small, right? But there was two people, two men, O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford. These were businessmen, right? I believe, I don't know about J.B. Stratford, but I believe O.W. Gurley was formerly enslaved. And he created skills and he owned a store. And his stores became very popular in the North and Southeast. And so as he began to invest in insurance, which a lot of black folks in the 19th century got, not a lot, but those who did get rich, most of them got rich off of investing in insurance. He became very wealthy from insurance. And then J.B. Stratford was another black man that was a very extremely successful businessman that also heard about the opening up of these lands in Oklahoma. And so they worked together. And what they did was they took themselves almost kind of like, y'all ever heard of LaFace Records? LaFace Records? Babyface and L.A. Reid? Babyface and L.A. Reid, right? And so when they got like all this money from Sony, they said, oh, well, where are we gonna set up our record company? And of course, everything was in LA and in New York, but they decided to set it up in Atlanta. And that's where a lot of these unsung, untapped talent came out of Atlanta and in the South specifically during that time. And so that's kind of what they did. It just came to my mind, but that's kind of what they did. They were like, okay, where are we gonna set up our headquarters? Where are we gonna set up our investment, particularly for black people? And what they decided was they were going to set it up in Oklahoma, and specifically Tulsa, because that was untapped land and that was untapped talent where black people were moving to. And of course, everybody was in New York and Philadelphia and Boston and all these places. And they say, nobody's moving to Oklahoma. Let's set up shop there and let's invest in all of these black people that are moving there. Let's give them money. Let's give them loans. Let's build schools. Let's build stores, and we can see what we can do out there. And so literally these two men with all their money moved out to Tulsa and began to provide loans for black folks. And that's actually how Black Wall Street became popular, just by these two very rich black men. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Yes, so we'll get there in a second, because I know you talked earlier about the oil. Oh, what happened to the oil? I don't know what happened to the oil, but actually the owners of those oil, it was white folks. I don't know if y'all have ever seen the movie Sarah's Oil. Sarah's Oil is a movie that's out now. If you can, take your young people to go see that movie. They did everything they could to try to take over that land from that young girl who believed that oil was on her land, and she wouldn't let them. And she fought for decades and decades to keep that land. And she was only, I think by the end of it, there was a lot of things happened, and she didn't get to retain as much as she should have. But she became, I think, the first or the youngest black millionaire, because she would not let these white folks take over their land. But unfortunately, that was not the case for many black folks. Yes. Yeah. Mm. Mm. You have to have the oil rigs and all that, yeah. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. No, I haven't heard about that. So as black folks began to move to Oklahoma and specifically Tulsa, it was nicknamed the Magic City. And it was called the Magic City because, again, like you were saying, oil was being discovered on these lands, and it was producing the state of Oklahoma was producing about 2,000 oil barrels a day, and it was leading the country in producing oil, and this allowed for many white people to be very wealthy, right? As more and more people were discovering oil in Oklahoma, right? Particularly white people who were able to afford the oil rigs, because it's not just about being on top of oil. You actually have to take the oil and turn it into something. You got to refine it, and you have to have the type of money, the type of resources, the oil rigs, be able to afford the oil rigs necessary to take this oil and turn it into and refine it so you can turn it into gas and different things that you need it for. And so for those already wealthy white people, they became even more wealthy. And so because they became wealthy, the black people that worked for them, the black people that they did business with, also became wealthy. So that wealth began to trickle down to many black folks. And then you have to think about it, black folks, many of them were way more skilled than white folks during that time, right? Because we done had 200 years of perfecting these skills. So many of us were more skilled than white folks during that time, and I would argue was naturally smarter. So we started to benefit from the backdrop and the trickling down of this wealth that was coming from these oils, from these oil rigs and the creation of oil. And that is essentially what happened. It was the wealth of oil, and it was the segregation that was intended to hurt black folks, but instead what it did was it helped us, right? It hurt us politically, and yeah, it hurt us politically, but it helped us financially. Because what happened was black folks could work in the jobs in the town. They could work in the jobs on the black side of town. They could work in the white side of town. They could work at the white jobs. They could work in the white cities, and they could charge top dollar and get paid, but they couldn't live there. They couldn't do business there. So black people came into the town to work, and then when it was time to leave, they had to go back where in order to live and shop? Where did they have to go? They had to go back to Tulsa. They had to go back to the black side of town. And this was because segregation was legal during this time. And so because of this, enterprising black people said, well, if they can only shop here, then why don't we create a business district for ourselves? Everything that white folks got that we can't go to, we'll just create, and we'll allow that dollar to circulate here. And that's essentially what we did. So enterprising black people started to create their own businesses. We created our own business districts. And then by 1921, we created so many businesses that there was limitless opportunities in terms of what we could afford and what we could do. And so this is when the notion of the Greenwood District came to be. And so essentially Tulsa was two cities. Tulsa was two cities. You had the black part that was on the northern part of the city, and then you had the white part, which was on the southern part of the city. And so black people would come south to work, and then they would have to go back north to do everything else. So again, economically it worked for us, but socially it wasn't good for us. And again, like I said, I think I want to make it clear that it was only good financially, because even in governing, we still couldn't govern ourselves. We couldn't become police officers. So white police officers could stay in the South, and then they could come up north. They could arrest us for whatever they wanted to arrest us for. They could do whatever they wanted to do and then come back home. So it was not still a free place. We weren't still completely independent, but financially we were very well off, right? And so, yeah, so I just kind of wanted to make sure that I talked about this, and then I'll go into a little bit more of the details of what life was like at Black Wall Street. I saw your hand, and I'll come to you. Mm-hmm. Correct. Colossians? Yeah. Mm. 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 Who is it? Mm-mm. Mm. 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 Right. Mm-mm. I ain't seen that, brother. Mm-mm. Oh, are the UFOs real? Who knows? Mm-mm. I saw your hand, brother. Go ahead. Okay. Mm. Mm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. 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 All right, brother Baruti. Mm.
Yeah, I was gonna say, interesting that you started out up there with the word that signifies the first letter in the acronym for the Gap Band.
Yes, Greenwood. Mm.
Right. Because the Gap Band was from the Tulsa area. They acronymized the name of the group, Gap Band, for Greenwood Arts and Crime.
Yes.
The three major streets in this district for Black Wall Street.
Yes.
It's kind of that you would bring up the Greenwood section.
Yes. And has anybody ever heard the song They Dropped the Bomb? They dropped the bomb on you. They dropped the bomb on you by the Gap Band. So it's said that that song is actually about Black Wall Street. And it's about how bombs were dropped on Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm getting ready to talk about that to obliterate that city or that town because of this false accusation that this black man had sexually assaulted this white woman, right? And so they say that yes, you know, that's the song that we dance to, party to, but the song is actually about the story of Black Wall Street. They dropped a bomb on, oh yeah, they dropped a bomb on me. So the Greenwood section, and yes, the G, that's G for the Gap Band, GAP, Greenwood. Greenwood section of Oklahoma, or Tulsa, was the center of African American life during that time. So if you think about Jacksonville and you think about La Villa, right? During the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, or if you think about if you lived in New York and you think about Harlem, or if you live in Chicago and you think about Bronzeville, this is what Tulsa, Oklahoma was during this time, and it had over 1,100 residents, and it was about 36 square blocks, and At this time, this was in the 1920s, 1910s and 1920s, there was about 108 Black-owned businesses, owned and completely operated and run by Black people. They had 2 theaters, 2 schools, 15 doctor's offices, and it was an area filled with drugstores, grocery stores, cleaners, hotels, anything you could think of that we need in terms of our lives, in terms of our maintaining ourselves, we created for ourselves. And so when Booker T. Washington got here, I forgot what year it was, when he came down, this was shortly before he died, he came down to visit Tulsa and he saw how magnanimous it was. He saw how rich it was. He saw how amazing these Black people were living, and he called it the Negro Wall Street of America, right? So that's where we get the term Black Wall Street. We got it from Booker T. Washington. When he got there, he called it the Negro Wall Street of America. And because we were barred from shopping in other places and being in other areas, again, it's basic economics, supply and demand. If there's a large supply of money that these Black people have, and there's a demand for basic goods and services, we begin to meet that demand ourselves, and that's how Black people essentially got rich in that area. Not to mention, many people believe that it was during this time that Black folks were not just doing business in America, in the Americas, and in Oklahoma, but we were actually, those of us who were on land with oil on it, we were actually trading oil and trading with African countries during this time. We were doing business internationally. We had planes. There are some sources that say that Black people own planes. This is in the 1910s. So airplanes were extremely new. And Black people in Tulsa owned planes and were going across onto the continent and not only doing business nationally, but internationally with African people as it pertained to oil. So Tulsa was a very, very, very rich and powerful place. So I want to jump a little bit into the story of Black Wall Street. So essentially, as we know, eventually it was obliterated. And this is kind of a symbol of what became of the city and what happened. And so the story well, before I go into the story, it's crazy because, again, this was, in the 1920s, and it literally took these people decades to build this city up to where it was. And it took them less than 24 hours, not even a full day, for everything to be destroyed. Right? Not a full day. Hold on, give me 1 second, brother. Not a full day. Although Tulsa was a major city in Oklahoma, the KKK had an enormous presence there. They were all over the South. They were all over the Southwest. And also during this time, we talked about this last class, there was something called the Red Summer. Does anybody remember what we talked about with Red Summer and what that was? Race riots. There were race riots all over the country during the Red Summer of 1919. Does anybody remember why there were so many race riots during that summer? Anybody remember why? Yeah, so we talked about World War I, and Black folks were coming back from World War I, and they were coming back with more cachet, we're moving from the South to the North and getting jobs up North. And when we got those jobs and when we got those opportunities, we started to move into not Black neighborhoods, we started moving into white neighborhoods. And white folks ain't like that. So they were pushing back against the prosperity of Black people. They were pushing back against how close we were getting in terms of where we were living. And so they began to attack Black folks all over the country. And Black folks began fighting back. So in Chicago, in Wilmington, in Rosewood, in Florida, all over the places, there were these race riots that were jumping off. Chicago was actually the worst race riot. So a lot of times we think the worst things were happening in the South. Chicago in the Midwest was actually some of the most racist places in the entire country. Dr. King has gone on record saying some of the worst racism he had ever experienced, worse than Birmingham, worse than Georgia, worse than Mississippi, was when he went to Chicago, right? So it's not just a Southern thing, this is an American thing, okay? And so these riots were, white folks were attacking black people all over. And so this was something that had been going on for summers and years. So around 1921, again, same thing happened, but the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot was probably the worst one in history in terms of devastation. And about thousands of people were killed, a lot of people were killed and thousands of people were left homeless. They said upwards about 300 black people died, right? 300 black people died, and about $5 million in damage was done in 1921. And if we were to convert that to today, it would be about it would be in the billions in terms of dollars and in terms of damages that were done just in Tulsa. So when we talk about wealth in our community, and when we talk about why black people collectively don't have as much wealth as we should, and many people say it's because black people buy Rams and black people buy Jordans and black people buy, we spend money on our hair or our nails and da-da-da-da. It ain't enough. Jordan ain't made enough shoes. It ain't enough weave. It ain't enough Cadillacs. It ain't enough clothes we can buy to make up for how much money and how much of our wealth that was taken just through these race riots. Just in Tulsa alone, just one small city, you have billions of dollars of wealth that, imagine if that city had been left alone, imagine how much wealth would be in our communities right now, just from that one city. And do you know how many Tulsas existed? I'm gonna tell you, it was over 100 Tulsas that existed in our country. It was over 100. So when we talk about the wealth that does no longer exist in our communities, it's not because we spend it away, it's because it was destroyed. It was taken away from us. That's why we don't have the wealth that many white folks have, because these types of cities and these types of towns and this type of wealth, not just in white settlements, but also in Asian territories where you have Little China, Little Italy. There's never been a Little Italy that's been destroyed. There's never been a Little China or Asia or a Chinatown that's ever been destroyed. But you have hundreds of black towns that have been destroyed. And that money and that wealth was taken away from them and was not able to be passed down like it has been in the communities of other people, right? And so I think it's very important for us to consider that when we talk about the lack of wealth and the lack of resources in our community and in our families. Much of that wealth is not because we spent it, it's because it was destroyed in situations like Tulsa, right? So we're going to go to the actual story. I'm sorry, you had your hand raised earlier. Yes, sir. Mm. 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 No, I haven't. What I'm gonna do though, because I'm gonna save, because you talking about some good stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna save a lot of what you're talking about after we get done with this topic, and then I'm gonna give you the space, maybe towards the end, to ask some of those questions, because I think you're gonna take us into another topic. But I appreciate you, brother. Oh, yes, sir. Okay, all right. Because now I'm trying to remember where we were. Oh, yes, the story, the story of Black Wall Street. Dick Rowland was the brother's name, right? And he was a black guy that worked in Tulsa, right? He was actually in high school, and he dropped out of high school. He went to Booker T. Washington High School. He dropped out of high school because he wanted to work. He wanted to make money for his family. This wasn't uncommon at the time, as it wasn't as common as it is now for people, black or white, to graduate high school. It was a big accomplishment. But many young people would drop out so that they could make money for their families, and that's what he did. So he dropped out of high school so that he could get a job shining shoes in downtown Tulsa. And so when he worked in downtown Tulsa, there was only one restroom that was available in the place where he lived, or in the place where he worked. There was only one restroom that was available. It was on the second floor. And so he decided when he what he would do is he would go, and when he would go on the elevator, he would go to the second floor to use the restroom. Well, when he walked onto the elevator, there was a white woman that was on the elevator, and she was working the elevator. So she took the elevator. This was during a time where it wasn't like you press the button and you go up. There was somebody there who pulled the elevator to the different floors. So it was a white woman that worked the elevator. So the story, and her name was Sarah Page. So the story goes that he went on the elevator, the doors closed, nobody knows what happened. But when the elevator opened, she ran out and she was screaming, right? She ran out screaming. And it was suggested that he had assaulted her. Now, what people who were, one story that has been popular says that actually what happened was when he walked onto the elevator, he tripped. And when he tripped, he fell on top of her, right? He fell against her. And when he did that, she started screaming and she ran out of the elevator, okay? So when she started screaming, she ran out. The people in the place was confused and they didn't know why she was screaming. And so, as we know, like when stories get told, if I tell you a story, right? I don't know if y'all do this in school. If I tell you a story and then you tell her the story that I told you, and then you tell her the story that I tell you, and it goes all the way around, by the time we get to this brother, what's going to happen to that story? It's a totally different story. It's a totally different story. So by the time this story got from whatever happened to this white woman on the elevator, and it got to one person and another person, by the time it got to the newspaper in Tulsa, it was a totally different story. This black man had went into this elevator and he raped this white woman and he beat her up, and she ran out crying, and she didn't know what she was going to do, and she was almost dead. And so this is what happened with the story by the time it got to the newspaper, okay? And every time they told the story with each telling, it made people more and more angry, more and more upset. And so essentially what happened is that within about the more and more they were telling the story, the more angry people got. And so the white folks in southern Tulsa got so angry that they created a mob and they went to the jail. They called the police, they arrested the boy, right? They took him to jail. The mob came and there was maybe about 300 people in the mob, right? And they were yelling and screaming at the sheriff, let him go, give him to us, because of course they were gonna hang him, right? Give him to us. And they were getting ready to kill this boy, and the sheriff said, no, he got to go through the due process. He needs to go to court, all of this. But they would not let this boy go. So some World War I veterans from the black part of Tulsa heard what was going on. They got their guns, they got their rifles, and they came down to the jail. And they demanded to be able to protect the boy while he goes through the due process, while he goes to court. The sheriff told these black men who were former World War I veterans, he said, I guarantee you nothing's gonna happen to him. We're gonna protect him, he's gonna be okay. They said, are you sure? Because we got more where this come from, and we will come down here and we're gonna protect him. He said, you don't have to worry about it. We'll make sure he's okay. We'll make sure nothing happens. So the veterans went back to the black part of Tulsa, right? More and more white people, it was about 17 hours went by, and more white people started to come. And the crowd got larger and larger and larger, and it gathered from about 300 people to about 2,000 people. And once it got that big, black folks came back because they're like, this looks like this is about to get out of hand. What are you going to do? And they promised him, they said, we promise you nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen to him, right? As they were getting ready to leave, there was a black man with a rifle. And the black man was walking away to go back to the black part of Tulsa. And there was a white guy that saw him and said, hey, what are you going to do with that gun? And he said, I'm going to use it if it's necessary. And the white guy said, no, you're not. And he grabs the gun and they begin to tussle. And as they begin to tussle, the rifle goes off. And when the rifle goes off, what do you think happened with that crowd? The crowd went crazy. Once that rifle went off, the crowd went crazy. People began knocking over things, beating up people, beating up the black guys that came down to protect the guy, and things went awry. But it was very dark at the time. And so what happened was the crowd decided that they were going to wait. They were going to wait until the sun rose, right? And when the sun started to rise, they began to march from the south part of Tulsa up to the northern part of Tulsa. And they marched up to the northern part of Tulsa until they got to the Greenwood district. And by the time they got to the Greenwood district, these were thousands and thousands of white people with torches, with guns, with all kinds of things. And they were coming towards Tulsa, Oklahoma. And by the time they got there, it was completely out of hand. And it got so bad that the same policemen that were protecting the boy who was arrested, the crowd was so large, guess what they did? They decided what? We got to join the mob. And so they left their posts because there was so many of them and they could not hold back the mob. They joined the post and they marched up to Tulsa, to the black part of Tulsa where the black folk was, and they joined the mob that ended up burning down all of Tulsa. And so when they went up there, they joined the mob, and as they were burning down all of these buildings, the theaters, the stores, the churches, every place that black people owned in Tulsa, any black person that was fighting back, any black person that was shooting back, any black person that defended themselves, they detained them and they arrested them, right? And so there was really essentially nothing that any of the black people could do in Tulsa to defend themselves from this riot. Homes and businesses were looted and burned, and essentially, after fighting, black people could only do either one of two things. They could fight until they died, or many of them talked about how they literally just left and fled. They took everything they had, everything they could carry in their hands, and fled. And so essentially black people were wound up in detention centers, and the ones that stayed, particularly the men, the ones that stayed were arrested. Then, like we were talking about with the Gap Band, it was said that bombs were dropped from an airplane onto the city. Some survivors said that it did happen. Other survivors have said that they don't remember seeing bombs being dropped from an airplane onto the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we don't really know for sure if that happened because all of the sources don't say that it did. Some people say that it wasn't bombs, it was actually nitroglycerin that was used to propel the fires. But the reason why these airplanes existed was because when the mob had gotten so big and the police had joined the mob that nobody could stop them, a telegram was sent to the governor of Oklahoma. And that governor had sent a request to the National Guard to say, hey, we need the military to come in and quelch this mob because it's gotten way too big and way too large. And so that's essentially what happened. The military declared martial law on the city, and eventually they calmed the violence down within 24 hours. And so once they calmed the violence down and the city was no longer burning, that is where you see all of the devastation, the pictures of the people that died, the businesses that were burned, the families that were decimated during this time. And so essentially that was what happened again in less than 24 hours of this race riot. And then after the National Guard had stopped the violence, essentially the black people that were left were detained and they were put in detention centers, and the white folks, they just told them to go home. Okay? Just told them to go home. And that's essentially what they did. And so they went home and basically just act like nothing happened. Act like nothing happened. And with all of these black people being in detention centers, remember, what did we say in the very beginning, right? There were black people that worked for these white employers and black people that worked for the white businesses in the southern part of Tulsa. So if you just came and arrested all these black men and all these black people in Tulsa, and now you going back to work, what's gonna happen? You ain't got nobody to work for you. All your employees are arrested because of a mob that you started, a riot that you started. So black folks, those black people that were arrested got released, but they only got released because the white employers say, we need our workers back. We need our workers back. So they released all the shoe shine boys. They released all workers so that they could come back and work for them, and they put special tags on them to say, hey, they belong here, they work for this company, they work for this group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so essentially this occurred, and people essentially just wanted to forget that this even happened. But there were political leaders, right, and there were business leaders in the southern part of Tulsa that were embarrassed by what happened. There were those few white folks that were extremely rich that said, I can't believe that this is what has happened in our state and this is what has happened in our city. And so they came together, and it was almost kind of like a reconstruction. They began to pledge to actually reconstruct and rebuild the black businesses that they had destroyed. Now, we all know what happens when we try to do a reconstruction. Does it ever really happen? No. And that's exactly what happened here. They had all of these political loopholes. They had all this legislation that made it almost impossible to give these black people money, the ones that were left over, the black people the money to be able to rebuild Tulsa. And essentially, at least for this time, it never happened. So even when they tried to so-called make up for it, they didn't put the right protocol in place so that the black people that were left could actually rebuild it back somewhat to what it was before. Mm. 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 Mm.
So that was a conspiracy. They don't want us to be independent of it. They don't want to have no farmland. They don't want to have anything. And so that's what they're doing now. And they don't want us to do nothing, so they do everything they can, like population control, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
You heard of Margaret Sanger?
Mm-hmm.
You know what she did?
Yes. Started Planned Parenthood and all that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. But to answer your first question, and I agree with all of that, except for the first part, because you said who actually gave them the money and the resources to start that Black Wall Street. It was who did I say provided the loans for them to start that Black Wall Street? The first two, this came from Black money. So it wasn't white folks that gave them this money to start this district. These were Black people. These were our own, right? That does happen where you have to get loans from the bank and loans from the government to start things. But in this case, that wasn't the case. This was all owned and operated and self-governed and initiated and founded all by Black folks, right? So this wasn't them lifting us up and taking it away. This was us lifting ourselves up. And then they came and took it away. How many of you have ever heard of John Hope Franklin, the historian, John Hope Franklin? John Hope Franklin's father was actually a lawyer in Tulsa, Oklahoma during this time, right? He was a lawyer, and he had just moved to Tulsa, and he set up his law offices in Tulsa just months before the riots, right? Months before the riots, he set up his law offices there, but he didn't leave. He stayed. And when no white person was sent to prison, he actually, when no white person was sent to prison, and when the reconstruction that they said that they were going to do to give the money back to Black folks so they can rebuild it, when it didn't go through, he sued the state of Oklahoma and helped to ensure that at least some money came back to those Black people so that they could rebuild the city of Tulsa, right? So John Hope Franklin's dad, Buck Franklin, was actually a part of that reconstruction process. So I'm sure you're probably asking yourself the question, okay, so we know this happened. Whatever happened to the guy that got arrested, and whatever happened to the white girl that claimed that she was sexually assaulted by this Black man? Technically, the sheriff was right. They did protect him. I don't know if they protected him, but essentially nothing happened to him. So all of these people that they ended up killing in Tulsa and burning these buildings and burning these businesses, the actual person that they was mad at, they never got to him. He was able to eventually leave town. And I think he might have moved to Texas, I believe, or something. And the white girl, Sarah Page, actually never testified against him, which lets you know it's almost impossible that he actually did what they said he did. So the whole reason for them doing this meant nothing, and it really had nothing to do with a false accusation. What do you think it had to do with? Why do you think those white folks were so mad at those Black folks up there? Jealousy. Jealousy and envy. Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. If the fact that this woman didn't even testify against him, and the man was eventually let go, he was exonerated and eventually left town, it lets you know that they knew deep down that this man didn't actually do what they said he did. But it was because of jealousy, I believe, and I think many of us believe, it was because of the jealousy. It was because they saw that even in the midst of segregation, even in the midst of undereducation, these black people were still able to find a way to be prosperous and to be even more prosperous than us, who actually owned the oil rigs, owned the oil development, and they still didn't have as much money as we did, because we knew how to take what we had and work together and make ourselves prosperous and make ourselves rich, right? And they were envious and they were jealous of that. And that, I strongly believe, and many of us strongly believe, was the reason why they ended up decimating Tulsa. Saw your hand. Mm. 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 Right. I didn't think about that, but that's a good point. This could have all been a setup to say, oh, we're going to use this now as an opportunity to have a reason to go and destroy this place. Right. Mm. Absolutely. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Mm. 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 So to talk about as we come to a close, because I think we're getting ready to wrap up a little bit. We're almost at 3:00. The grand jury ended up blaming the black folks and blamed African Americans for the riot, right? So of course the state, the grand jury blamed us. Are we surprised, right? And so, sorry, I spelled that wrong. But and basically said that it was up to the city, and the black people had to rebuild Black Wall Street with no assistance by the city or by the state of Oklahoma. And so it was put on us and whoever else was left to help revitalize the city of Tulsa. Yes, ma'am. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. Right. 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 Mm. 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 And it's the same thing. I mean, we see, and even though they were able to revitalize in the 1930s and 40s, we've seen how this wasn't the last race riot. We've had race riots since then, and we've had them all well into the 50s and 60s, and of course, all the way up until the 90s with the LA riots and that kind of thing. So these things are not new, but I heard somebody say, and I thought this was very important when looking at the documentary that talks about this. When we look at it, the guy actually said, the historian said, the story of Tulsa is not a story about the riots. The story of Tulsa is a story about the resistance after the riots. So the spirit of Tulsa was not taken away when they destroyed those buildings, and it wasn't taken away when they killed those people and forced other people to have to migrate out of Tulsa, but they still rebuilt Tulsa a decade later. It wasn't to its original status. It didn't look like it did during that time, but those black folks still took the money that they had, and the ones that were left were able to rebuild Tulsa to some degree so that they be self-governing. But then after that, guess what happened in the 1950s? Now you got the highways. Now you got urban renewal, right? Now you got the highways that's running right through Tulsa and decimated that. And then anything else left over after that was decimated by desegregation. So once desegregation occurred and the black folks that were left were able to move now to the white part of Tulsa, were able to buy homes, go to schools on the south side of Tulsa, then that was what really took not the spirit, I wouldn't say the spirit of Tulsa, but what was left of the economic and the political strength of Tulsa. So it wasn't even the riots. It was the riots plus the urban renewal and desegregation, and that is what really did what it did to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, but these are things that the city leadership refused to talk about and did not want to talk about for a long time. And it took them decades and decades. And again, just like Juneteenth, us pushing. And that's why we have to keep pushing and keep fighting and keep struggling and keep staying on their necks over and over and over for decades, sometimes years and years and decades. And finally, eventually, we forced the people of Oklahoma, we forced the people of Tulsa to remember and to recognize and apologize for what they allowed those people to do to our city and to do to our people. And currently now they have a Greenwood Cultural Center that tells that complete story of the Tulsa race riots, and you can go there and you can visit that Greenwood Cultural Center to this day.
Built all that stuff to us and set us up with it. I used to be an insurance man, and they had daylight grocery store right here. You know, both daylight, they had people living in moving houses up there, and I used to go to the insurance money. All that went away, and the burning question, who built all that stuff and set us up in business? Who built out a church over there in Atlanta? The church we had in Atlanta, Jack Henry Church, who built it for them? I heard they built it for free. Now, what happened to all the business we had in Jacksonville? Who took them from us? Is that anything to do with Wall Street way that you're talking about now? We ain't got nothing now. We ain't got a lot of this here.
Couple more things, yes. Our own businesses. You had your hand raised? We got another question. Is Black Wall Street a possibility in the future? I would argue that I do believe that there is I believe that since then we have created other forms of Black Wall Street, right? Of course, we live in a much more digital age. We live in an age of much more advanced technology. And I do believe that in many ways we have recreated, if not physically or exactly like Black Wall Street, the symbolism and the spirit of self-determination, of self-governance. I do believe that we have pockets of it, just like there were pockets of a Tulsa, a Rosewood, a Jasper, a Wilmington, a Harlem, and all these different places. I believe that we do have pockets, and I believe it's important for us to find ways to bring all of those pockets together so that we can have a collective Black Wall Street that's not just economic, but that's economic, that's political, that's militaristic, that we can completely control, not just in the Americas, but globally. I believe that that's what's necessary. But I do believe that we can and we have, in many ways, have recreated what we've seen with Black Wall Street.
One is saw some 1960s footage in various spaces where urban renewal was mentioned. And the phrase was mentioned was that urban renewal equals Negro removal.
Yeah.
And so study should be done on the dismantling of black communities
Sure.
based upon the urban rural project.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a few comments a second ago about the idea that immigration was worse than force. I'd like to just get a thought of that. I think there's nothing wrong with having geographic cultural hegemony, meaning that certain groups may dominate certain spaces, have their own roots and territory. However, I think that in the U.S., it's kind of gradually double-edged sword. I don't think that separation is bad or cultural hegemony, but separation could not ever be fair as long as you were separated based upon the apartheid objectives of white people, where black people wouldn't have equal resources. So we're talking about, yes, black people having their own country, yes, and we have equal resources, okay. But apartheid is never going to be equal, no matter how you cut it, so you might be separate and unequal. Just as in Black Wall Street, yes, we're separate, and yes, we're doing the best we could for ourselves, but not without circumstances of being surrounded by white people, where the collapse of Black Wall Street physically was a bombing from the air. So I think that we should think about that and think about where we go forward with whatever plans we think we should have for our people and how this should be positioned in a hostile den of wolves, sharks, bears, and whatever other predators are around.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, your answers.
Martin helped us to believe that we should be as separate as the labor man, as people fish. So, if that's the case, and that is what I believe, then segregation is not purpose. However, because, and this is devil talking, everybody died and buried God. For some strange reason, we look on the outside to false leaders and these people who tell us how we should think, other than to think for ourselves. I think this is how we got and how we keep continuing to be in the situation that we're in, because we don't believe that we should be as separate as the fingers on a hand and as equal as a fist. We individually don't believe that. And if we did, we would be more critical thinkers, we would think for ourselves, and we would actually do for ourselves. And I assure you that if all of us began to think that way, that we can create whatever we want to create. But because we allow other people to think for us, black, white, blue, green, and yellow, we allow that. And because we allow that, then we continue to be like this. And as far as us having another Tulsa, that's not impossible. But because, again, a lot of us look around you and you'll see we are not thinking for ourselves because we don't even believe in ourselves. That's why we have to have young people growing up these days who have no idea what they look like and who they are.
Hold on.
You have to realize, all them hundreds of years, we have been trained to think a certain way, and they have been trained to think a certain way. And then we kind of sort of lied. Well, you know, if Master came and he said, asked you out, was everything cool? You said, yeah, but you didn't want to die. So that level of mentality just got passed on to generation. So we got a whole lot to fight against. There's a whole lot. My attitude is at least we recognize that the problem is there. If you don't know the problem is not there, you don't know what to do. So we recognize the problem is there. You gotta, like she said, you gotta push it on the kids. And the Black Wall Street is right here. I was at Tropical Smoothie earlier today with my daughter, only because she got something free. Way out by IKEA and stuff. And I wanted a smoothie, but I said I'm gonna wait till I get back over near the house, and then I'll come here and get it. And that's your Black Wall Street.
Right.
We don't have to necessarily separate from them. Get them to spend some of their money with us.
With us, yeah.
You know? So we ain't got to necessarily, and then there are places. I just read about, I think it was like 13 and 14 families who bought a large piece of land.
In
Georgia. And they're gonna farm it together.
Yeah.
So that's their little city. You know? Them and their children. So it's happening, especially with the internet.
Yeah.
My thing is, when I come in contact with young people, I just want to tell them little stuff. You know, we talk about, like with Reigns and Reebok, you know, a little rivalry. I said, you know where that come from? It has nothing to do with the football exactly. There's a black school and a white school. They built their black school so we didn't go to their white school. You know, and so now it's just a North Side, we all call it North Side pride rivalry type thing now. So, you know, she made a very valid point, and subconsciously, to a certain level, we tend to still, like with colorism, we still tend to think what we've been trained, and we got trained that because if we didn't train it, we'd die. That's what these children need to understand. That the reason why we thought that way, because we're trying to stay alive. But a lot of them slaves, they're not going to tell you about all the plantations they burnt down. You know, plantations they burned down. You know what my daddy told me? He was in the military. Got to be World War II. He was in the Air Force when it was connected to the Army. He said when they got overseas, they sent them out there with no bullets. They sent the black folk out first with guns with no bullets, so that the enemy could shoot them up and use up their bullets on us. And then the white guys came. But my daddy said they went and stole some bullets out of the armory. You know, they say they ain't trying to get shot up. But it's such a psychological thing that we have to fight against, and the young kids just have no clue of how intense it is. You know, I'm not that old, but I remember Hemming Park having, you know, water fountain colored and white. I remember that. I remember not being able to go to the bathroom down there. You know, my mama worked. My mama was a caterer, and there was a white lady who owned the store, and she would let us use the bathroom if nobody else was in the store. You know, go in there, hurry up, and come back out. So it ain't been that long ago, and they need to really understand that. They need to really understand it, and we're seeing it all. We're seeing it all over again.
Yes, I
It's
am.
Project 2025. They just ain't paying attention. That's serious.
Yes, ma'am. Last one, because I know we got to end. I'll end with you.
Yes, I have a question for the audience. I just want to preface with something. When the lady here was talking in response to the integration question, and she was mentioning that about being the value, benefit of being as separate as the fingers, but working as the hand. And she was attributing that to Dr. King saying that. And I looked over and I said, oh, wait a minute, didn't mean Booker T. Washington, because I always associated that statement that he was saying as well when asked to, defend his point about why we should stay in the South and be industrially progressive and concentrate on economics and what the circumstances would be about how Black people would be positioned in the South. And so she was saying that Dr. King was also saying that statement. Right. So if Dr. King is saying the valor of being separate as the fingers, but work as the hand, I'd like to ask the audience here, well then, are we?
The word is as equal, separate as the fingers,
Right.
but as equal as the hand.
As the hand, right. He advocated that, and that, right. Right. I know.
The same good books that the white kids could have at their school doing segregation, the white kids can have the same good books
Right.
Yes.
at their school.
Yes.
Just as an example,
I understand.
Equal. Okay, let me get him, and then I'm gonna answer that on out. Go ahead, bro.
Statement, right? And I'm saying that Dr. King said that. Have we been misled about the optics of the civil rights movement and about even Dr. King's position in it? If that was one of the positions that Dr. King had, what was the fallout of difference in philosophy between Malcolm X and Dr. King? If Dr. King believed that should be as separate as the fingers, but work as the hand.
So I think that's a really good point. And again, like you were with, we actually talked about in the last lesson, Booker T. Washington inspired. So we talked about that, and about how Booker T. Washington's philosophy of self-improvement also inspired Malcolm X and also inspired Dr. King. And so this idea of self-improvement, it's not uncommon that even though these people, well, Malcolm was more so within the same tradition as Garvey, but it's not uncommon that somebody could take a philosophy from this one person and then interpret that into these various movements, all right, and these various ways in which that can materialize. Because even Du Bois himself, as he got older, began to adopt and see things from the way in which his opposition, Booker T. Washington, was starting to see things. So it's not uncommon, and I think you raise a very good point, right, that have we been misled about some of Dr. King's philosophies and even some of the ways in which Dr. King appreciated some of these alternate movements that was happening during his time. And again, I think there has been a miseducation. There's this idea Dr. King was anti, Black-owned businesses, or anti-self-improvement, or anti what the Nation of Islam was doing, or anti what the Black Power movement was doing, and that's absolutely not true. Dr. King appreciated the Black Power movement, whose philosophies really came out of Malcolm X's teachings, and he gave them a platform to be able to utilize in order to get their message across. He was not in total agreement with what Stokely Carmichael was arguing. He was not in total agreement with what was happening with the Black Panther Party. He did not believe in the owning of guns. He did not believe in the idea of violent self-defense. But the philosophy of doing for self and self-improvement, which was why he argued for reparations, which was why he argued against the misappropriation of the Homestead Act and those lands that I was talking about that was given to white folks that should have been given to Black folks who had worked that land for centuries and centuries. He spoke on that. And because he spoke on that, that is directly out of the Booker T. Washington philosophy. And so we are taught that because Dr. King was nonviolent, he was in complete disagreement with Malcolm X, and he was in complete disagreement with the Black Power movement, and he was in complete disagreement with all of these other philosophies, and that's just not true. What he was in disagreement with was the idea of using violence or using any type of violence, even self-defense, as a means of getting to that point. He always stated that he was completely nonviolent. And that nonviolent was only 100% a part of his philosophy after the 1960s. Because before the 1960s, he actually owned a gun himself. And he would use that gun, and he told Coretta to use that gun if necessary, if his house was ever attacked. So his 100% nonviolent philosophy was only applied after the 1960s. So Dr. King was very much one who could see the value in other philosophies and in other ideas, and he took what was necessary from it. But then he was also smart enough to separate himself from ideas that he didn't disagree with. And so I do believe that if we were taught, and if our young people were taught about who Dr. King was with more nuance and with much more care, I believe we would see that we actually have more in common than we do. Even if we disagree on a few things, we are actually what we talked about. We are actually separate. Even in this room, we all have separate ideas. We all may have separate beliefs or things that we may think could be of benefit or could be a challenge to Black people, but we're all here as one, because one of the things we do agree with is that we need to know our history. Our young people need to know their history, and we need to continue to teach this in our communities and teach it in the right way so that our people can have pride, our young people and our older people can have pride in who we are. And I think that is the hand that, even if we have varied philosophies, that is the hand that unites us. And when we focus on that unity, we can recreate a Black Wall Street in a different form, in a 2026 version. We can create a Greenwood in Eatonville. We can continue to spread the significance of Juneteenth and propitiate our culture and our historical meanings and all these things that are important to us. We can do that when we find the things that unite us and move forward in that way. So kind of wanted to end with that. I had a little bit more to go over, way past time. So thank you. I got go ahead. And that's very true, because nonviolence was a strategy. That was a strategy that was used. Correct. That was a strategy, and then use it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you to Cafe Resistance. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate y'all. Make sure that you sign the sign out sheet. Also, you may have gotten an email from me. Please fill out the survey. Please fill out the survey. Let us know how we're doing here. If there's ways that we can help improve what's happening in the Jacksonville community. So definitely go back to your emails, fill out that survey. Thank you all for being here. Please support the cafe and have a happy Juneteenth weekend. Thank you.